it's so complex and so miraculous and in such a specific order that I just don't see how anybody argues anything other than intelligent design. That quote I gave where it talked about the third infinite, where it said the cosmos feels infinitely large, the atomic realm infinitely small, and the cell is infinitely complex. Because when you think about that, like we've just scratched the surface of microbiology, but you are literally building 300 billion. Is that what it said?
A day.
300 billion of those intricately moving.
25 million a second.
Yeah.
Right now, 25 million. 25 million.
That's wild. With walking robots and rotary motors and post office sorting facilities and, you know.
It makes you believe that if one day microbiology could get to a place where you could like potentially live forever, if you could figure out how to. Oh
yeah, the reproduction of the cell in that way. Yeah.
Right? Because that's really why we age, is cell our cells dying off over time.
I read an article a long time ago about a guy who was waiting on a heart transplant and couldn't get it, was going to die. So he was part of an experimental program where they gave him a turbine heart. So when they EKG him, he flatlines always because he has no heartbeat. But they put a turbine in his heart, a titanium turbine that they said could run for 1,000 years. And he's got a turbine that's pumping blood through the 60,000 miles of veins in his body. But it's like, yeah, I mean, it's just wild to think about, you know? Like it's so complex and so miraculous and in such a specific order that I just don't see how anybody argues anything other than intelligent design. Yeah. So DNA, this is, you know, probably one of the most, I don't know what you'd call it, but points towards information and intelligent design as robustly as any other argument we've made. So consists of 4 nucleotides arranged in specific order. This order is not just random, it is communicative information. The development of all micro machines in the cells, the formation of proteins from amino acids is all dictated and driven by the human genome and the information encoded in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. So that's what's so interesting. We just talked about DNA was how many miles? We did that whole calculation. It was 95 billion miles of DNA.
57 billion.
Oh, 57 billion miles of DNA.
Yeah.
So when you think about what DNA is doing, is DNA is giving the code to build these cities in each cell, right? And so it's no wonder you have 57 billion miles of code because you're building 250 billion cities a day inside of each cell operating in your body.
300 billion. But who's counting?
300 billion. 300 billion. 300 billion a day.
You have to have that much DNA.
You would have to. Well, and what's so interesting is, did you know that I have a stat on DNA that a few grams of DNA could store the entire world's data. A few grams of DNA could store all the data in the entire world.
Make that make sense. I mean, that's just...
Well, then you think about how many grams of DNA are inside of us, how much data is stored, how complex is the system that it's producing? Irreducibly complex. Irreducibly complex. I mean, as we're getting into microbiology, it's like, yeah, you start to realize that a few grams of DNA could hold all the data in the world, and we've got tons and tons and tons of it inside of us. We're storing so much data input because we've got to build such complex machines inside of us to operate in the way that we do. Mind-blowing, dude. All dictated and driven by the human genome. This coded information is unique in that we do not observe information code anywhere else in the universe unless directed by intelligence. Stephen Myers has noted, as it turns out, specific regions of the DNA molecule called coding regions have the same property of sequence specificity or specified complexity that characterize written codes, linguistic texts, and protein molecules. Just as the letters in the alphabet of a written language may convey a particular message depending on their arrangement, so too do the sequence of nucleotide bases, A, T's, G's, and C's, inscribed along the spine of the DNA molecule convey a precise set of instructions for building proteins within the cell. Our personal experience tells us information comes only from intelligent sources. In fact, in the entire history of the universe and the history of science, not a single instance of information arising from anything other than intelligence has ever been identified. This presents a problem for those who attempt to stay in the room of the universe to account for genetic information. If we limit ourselves to the materials available to us in the universe, information must be explained from matter, chance, the laws of chemistry or physics, and nothing more. Nobel-winning biochemist Manfred Egan recognized this challenge when he said, "Our task is to find an algorithm, a natural law that leads to the origin of information. Efforts to account for the information in this way have repeatedly failed. In fact, the information in DNA proves to be the decisive stumbling block for every naturalistic theory offered for the origin of life." So a few grams of DNA could store the entire world's data.
Which, by the way, so how many grams of DNA
Don't
are in
know
our
in the
body?
human body? Look it up. I'd be curious to know, because I'd like to know how many times the world's information we're storing inside of our own body.
Grams of DNA in the body. Around, 50 grams of DNA.
Okay, so we have enough to store all the information in the entire world, say 15 to 20 times over?
Yep.
I mean, a few is 2, so 25 times. We could store 25 times the data of the entire world inside of us because of the amount of DNA we have.
And which, by the way, reaches
ChatGPT on steroids.
from the Earth to the sun and back 600 times.
Yep.
57 billion miles long.
57 billion miles of specific code. I mean, you talk about an intense computer program. That is freaking wild. Our DNA is 50% the same as a cabbage. There's 3 billion DNA letters contained in every cell. The length of the book written from our genetic code is equivalent to the length of 2,000 copies of Don Quixote's de la Mancha. Even more shocking, if we proceed to write the book of our DNA, assuming a typing speed of 60 words per minute and working 8 hours a day every day, it would take 50 years. Now let's talk about lengths. A 1 millimeter long piece of DNA contains 3 million bases or letters. If we unrolled and unpacked the DNA of a single cell, we would obtain a sequence of 2 meters in length. If we unwrap the total DNA of a human being, estimated to have about 38 trillion cells, its length would be more than 100,000 million kilometers, and it would weigh only 0.18 grams, an extension equivalent to making about 26,000 trips from the Earth to the moon.
Yeah.
Side note, possible combinations of DNA, 10 to the 600,000th, yet it's in a specific order that functions perfectly the way it does, that produces these micro cities inside of our cells that can do all sorts of incredible things. And we want to believe that all of that came from Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm not sold, Tyler.